Welcome, welcome everyone. We have a few folks that are coming in. So we'll get started here momentarily. We'll get started here. I'll give 60 seconds and then we will get going. Meeting is now streaming live on Facebook. Right on. Well, welcome everyone. I want to thank everyone for coming to the Center for Racial Harmony and coming to our very first virtual forum discussion. And we're very pleased to have some esteemed panelists with us today, along with our Center for Racial Harmony board members. But before we get started, I thought I'd just do some brief introductions. My name is Donna Moody, and I'm the president of the Center for Racial Harmony. I've been with the center and the board for about 2 decades, and I always find that so amazing because I don't think I am that old. I don't think I'm even 2 decades old, it seems, but I must be if I've been with them that long. But also our board members are in the house, and some of you may know them already. Bob Wells, Gerald Jones, Curtis and Ray Paradise, Yolande Diaz, Cheryl Gray, Janet Greenlee, and I don't know if I missed Paula Badger or not, but they're members of our board as well. And we here at the center, we've been around officially since 1992, but actually was in forming this organization in 1990 actually. And we are a third-party neutral organization. We are a non-for-profit organization, and our mission is pretty much in its name, the Center for Racial Harmony, where we're trying to have our conversations, critical conversations around race. But we know that it's just not only about race, it's about all of our beings, our whole. So we look at everything from a holistic viewpoint as well. But we have, like I said, been around since the early 90s. Our board members are all volunteer. They come from all walks of life in terms of business owners in the community of St. Clair County and Monroe. We're basically on the Illinois side. Doesn't mean that we don't welcome people from Missouri, but mostly from the Illinois side. So we have all walks of life, business owners, educators, clergy, retirees, military, veterans, you name it. We've had all kinds of people that have served on the board and of course have been general members as well. One of the things that we try to focus on throughout our year is a couple of things. One, we do a program for our youth that we just completed at the end of February, and it's kind of a recognition peer program that's called The Gathering. And then the other one is just this. We used to call them dinner tables. We're going to use a term, back in the day when we used to be sitting down at the table and breaking bread at the home style buffet. We would do those types of meetings about once or twice every other month, and get together and just have a topic of discussion, break bread, and just talk about it. Not trying to take sides, good, bad, or the other, just really just having some conversations. And so that has now, of course, evolved into a virtual opportunity. So this is just our very first virtual forum that we're having, and it's been prepared by one of our ad hoc committees that has been spearhead for this particular discussion by Bob Wells. And so with that, Bob, I'm going to toss it over to you and let you take it from there.
Thank you, Donna. Welcome. Good evening. Let me explain what we're attempting to do. As Donna said, we're a third-party neutral organization. What we're trying to do is we're trying to start the dialogue with reference to a thorny issue, an issue that has a lot of horns to it, one that can cause people to be upset with one another. The intent is that we're going to present this in a forum in which we have an open dialogue, and we're going to try to do it in a manner in which we get down to some critical discussions, but yet we're enabling ourselves to get down to the real issues that are involved and not get distracted by positions rather than interests. We have so many common interests that we don't have to get our positions out there each time. I start with the adage that I'd rather be smarter tomorrow than I am today. That can't happen unless I listen to somebody who disagrees with me today. So I'm actually going to give the panelists, which I'll introduce in a second, only 4 instructions, and that starts with the acronym ROPE, R-O-P-E. And what I'd like each of them to do is to respect the other panelists, to be open with their comments. We're not going to parse our words with all the political correctness that you might hope we give. And if you're a word that you think's out of context, take it with the manner in which it was intended. We sometimes can speak with our heart, but our mind just doesn't catch up with us. So give people the right to speak openly. We're going to be positive. We want to find out the positive things that our panelists want to say about the subject matter. Rather than criticizing the other panelists and what they may say, we want to advance some alternate theory or some alternate positive thing we're to do and empathize. The reason we have the panel picked the way they're picked is in order to give you 4 different walks of life, 4 different perspectives in order to have a better understanding of this very difficult issue. As a matter of fact, the center has already received a call from an individual who's against reparations. and that caller called in and wanted to tell us that he didn't want us to be supporting reparations. We haven't said we're going to support it or not support it. As a matter of fact, my role is that of being neutral. I'm here to try to make certain that both sides get a voice in this matter and that we drill down deeper. And I may be asking questions that I disagree with just to get the point across. Now, we have 4 panelists who are with us this evening, and I want to have an opportunity to see. Malik Ahmed, are you there? Malik, yes. Can we put him up? There we go. Malik is an individual who's in the Peace Corps. He has a child and he has 2 grandchildren 3 grandchildren in order to, get a lived experience. You get a lived experience a lot of different ways. He's also been in community development. He's been involved with reference to getting a degree in not only economics, but in public administrations, where he has a master's from SIU. He's been in the community his entire life, although he went in the Peace Corps and was in Africa for a period of time while in the Peace Corps. Next, we have on the panel, we have Brian Jack. Brian, can we have your photograph up there? Brian is a professor at SOUE. He teaches courses that are directly involved with reference to the topic this evening. Those topics include, historiography of slavery, American slavery through biography, and civil rights in St. Louis. And we'll call East St. Louis as well, because it's the metropolitan area. And so we welcome him to our program. Next, I'd like to introduce Sheila Burton. Sheila Burton is an individual who went to University of Notre Dame, then went to University of Illinois Law School. She also was with Land of Lincoln in education advocacy in their project, also with the Land of Lincoln Race Equity Task Force. And she started Join Hands in East St. Louis and has been down there in the community for the last 3 decades, trying to actually give lawyers a better name by reason of her public service. And we thank Sheila for what she's done. And she has lived experiences from what she's observed and how she's observed it. Finally, we have a free spirit, Richard Hudlin. Richard Hudlin will be, he's going to give us some definitions from time to time that he might want us to use. He's going to approach some problems a little more uniquely than you might expect from his perspective. He's lived in the community. I knew his cousin well, his namesake, Richard Hudlin. As a matter of fact, it's a pleasure to be with the Hudlin family. Both Sheila and I have been honored with the Richard Hudlin Award, which is given by the lawyers to an individual who is a lawyer who does something for the community. Now, Sheila deserved it, but I kind of snuck in her coattails. So anyhow, Richard will be, again, another voice with reference to what we're going to hear about. And he educated me a little about the program myself. And so I'll inject that at the appropriate time. So thank each of our panelists for joining us this evening. And so I'd like to start the program with where I think slavery has to start, in Africa. So I want to let any of the panelists want to give me some of the description of what they believe was the aspects that was most disruptive to the individuals who were enslaved in Africa from a cultural standpoint, a society standpoint, the values hierarchy. Anybody raise your hand? Let's get started.
Well, I'll start.
Okay.
The first thing I think that we should always remember about this whole tragedy called enslavement is that it involved human beings. It involved human beings who had very complex societies that had very strong family structures, very strong religious structures, had economic resources, specialized in various trades. And so these were human beings that got caught up in an economic system that involved, unfortunately, some African kingdoms that thrived on the enslavement.
Malik, before you get to that point, could you give maybe the audience an idea of actually what those individuals were doing before this tragedy took place?
Many of them were agriculturalists, specializing in the cultivation of food products, tobacco, cotton. Some of them were really experts in cattle raising, so other kinds of animal husbandry. Some of them were very proficient in metals. So these were really highly technical people that we're talking about that got involved in one of the most dehumanizing systems called slavery in the West in particular, that we need to always keep the audience focused on, because a lot of times, because of what Hollywood did and what popular fiction did, there was always this effort to make the people who were enslaved to look and seem as if these were illiterate people, semi-human, half savages, lived in uncultivated lands, come from societies with no government, no political.
Can I touch on that for a second? Would you give
Yes.
the audience some understanding of sort of the organization or the government or the way in which they were organized and how they lived as far as hierarchy?
Well, they were pretty much organized in kingdoms, or in some instances even empires. But they had their own unique political structure where a king or an emperor was the dominant political force. They had militaries, they had all kinds of things. On the other hand, there were some ethnic groups that were small, and lived in remote areas, lived in peace with their neighbors, um, did trade and other kinds of things. The most important thing, Bob, is that these were human beings and they lived in highly technical societies based on agriculture or based on fishery or based on cattle raising, a variety of things. The continent of Africa is vast, all kinds of things occurred there. It's an ancient place. So various empires, societies rose and fell, just like any other movement in civilization itself.
Malik, could I interrupt you for 1 second? I want to get
Sure.
your disruption and what happened to it, but I'd like the other panelists, if there is anything further you'd like to inject about what you believe existed on the continent of Africa before slavery became part of the trade to the New World?
Well, I lived in the country of Mali,
Oh.
and I think that everybody knows that the Malian Empire was a very vast empire that traded along the Sahara routes, that had complex educational systems, the educational universities in Timbuktu in particular, the writing skills. Most of that empire, in terms of the scholarship that came out of that empire, was comparable to Europe in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. So we're talking about people who had to endure this, that had very complex societies. That again, we're not talking about primitive people. We're talking about highly skilled individuals that got caught up in the most vicious system that humanity have seen.
Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, let me point out one tribe called the Dogons, who have information about astrology, about many other things that are unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. And they survived when Egypt fell. They survived by finding isolated places nobody else wanted to live in and live there. So they have survived with a great deal of knowledge and skills and technology. And they have among other things, a great way of ruling themselves. So, you know.
In fact, could I point out that those Dogon people that they're in the cliffs in Maui, and they had knowledge of Sirius A and B astrological information on star systems without using the telescopes and other kinds of things that the Western world was able to learn about in the 1920s. And these are people that had this information back in the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, and had it all a cosmology that was all well developed. And the Dogon people are also known for their mathematical genius. So, again, we're talking about people who are highly skilled in every art, medicine, dentistry, cultivation, mummification, deep concepts about life and what happens to the human soul as it transitions. So yes, this is not just one country. The Nigerians, the people in that area, Nigeria, Benin, they were smelting metals, iron, 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, creating all kinds of intricate metals works.
Okay, Brian, is there anything you'd like to add before we get into the actual disruption of those societies by the slave trade?
There's not much I'd like to add, except to just co-sign what Malik was saying, and to reinforce to people I do this with my students sometimes. They see Africa as a country or as one place, and trying to reinforce to them that we're talking about a continent with, hundreds of different ethnic groups and language groups and you know social organizations and things like that. And people will ask, well, how were Africans selling other Africans into slavery? And reminding them that Africa as a continent, that's a concept that's imposed upon the people there, right? That we're talking about people of individual ethnic groups, right? And just to kind of reinforce that.
Okay. And we've all seen some of the shows that have been there and individualized those people that you've all talked about. As Malik indicated, the whole concept is these were human beings. These were individuals. These were different countries, different people, different nations. And this is what was existing before the slave trade started. So Richard, I'm gonna let you start with what you think was the most stirring disruption to those citizens and to those nations and to those people by reason of what happened.
Very difficult question.
I
But
know it is. That's why I gave it to you.
Let's remember, in that era and before, slavery was everywhere, all around the world. It was when England outlawed first the slave trade and then slavery. They may have been the one and only nation in the world who outlawed slavery. So it was really very common. But the thing is, see, they chose a path to sell slaves. See, they made bad deals. They sold slaves for weapons, for tools, for liquor, stuff like that, rather than selling slaves for factories that for for the knowledge and skills they needed to build the great ships that came to their shores. And see the difference in Japan, for example. They tried to avoid contact with the West for a long time, but eventually, when they were forced, they adopted it whole hog and built up an economy, a society, culture, science, technology. So they became a formidable force in the world. And but the people in Africa, somehow or another, they did not have that vision. And unfortunately, the slave trade, coming in contact with Europeans with all this advanced knowledge and technology, they chose a poor path. So,
Malik, would you like to add to that?
Yeah,
I cut you off before, and I want to get back to you. This is where you were headed.
So you asked the question about the great disruption that took place. As Richard said, slavery has been a human institution from time immemorial. I think what the greatest disruption was when Europeans commoditized that trade, and it became a global trade. And when the global trade began to occur, these European nations began building forts on the coast. And that's when the terrorism, that's when the inhumanity of it took on another kind of presence. And at the same time, a lot of the economic systems, indigenous economic systems, were disrupted. And when you disrupt a system or a way that people made a living, the new way of making a living was to have some kind of involvement in the slave trade. So internally on the African continent, you had stronger nations dominating weaker nations, all for the purpose of selling to the Europeans who had dominated even the stronger nations. And then once that system, the invasion, if I can use that word, of Africa, of all of these European powers, the Dutch, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, and then later on the Netherlands, and then the French and the English, and on and on and on, the Germans.
Spanish.
That once, yes, the Spanish, definitely. Once you had that system, then that became the one of the most powerful economic systems in place. So you even had Europeans going to war with each other. So now there's a plethora of weapons on the continent. So now new technology of killing and inhumane, torture of people is all being produced because this African represents a commodity of great value that is helping to enrich European nations.
Well, let me ask you that last question, and I'll give this to the entire panel. And that is, you've talked about it as a commodity, inhuman. Explain a little how the shipment of this commodity and the inhumanity and brutality that went along with the transportation of these individuals, these people, from the continent of Africa to the shores of the United States. Brian, could you give some thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's very important for us to understand the rise of the transatlantic slave trade with the rise of capitalism and the global capitalist system, which created this insatiable desire in some sense for enslavement. There's a book that I use sometimes in my class called Captives as Commodities, right? That talks about the transatlantic slave trade and talks about how on the ships, it was the process of turning people into products, right? People into commodities.
And how was that done?
Through extreme violence, through extreme psychological torture, taking people's names and giving them numbers, through rape, through separating men and women and children, through putting people in the holds of the ships, in a space. There's some sources that give the space that were allocated on a tightly packed ship that allocated 26 inches basically for men and 24 inches, I think, for women.
And compare that with an airplane seat.
Yeah.
For a whole trip across the ocean.
For 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks in the hold of a ship, naked, in shackles, with, as they called them, necessary tubs, which are the barrels cut in half for people to use the restroom to defecate. People being rubbed raw on the holds of the ships. The psychological torture as well as the physical torture of that, right? Is
Richard, is there something you would add to some of that? The feelings of the individuals going through that?
No, I wouldn't. I think he has done a fine job.
Okay, Malik?
Yeah, I would say if we just think of the COVID-19, the fear of spreading this virus from one person to the other. Just imagine what that just the description of the whole must have been. The various diseases that were spread on that ship. And you're talking about all ships for a total of almost 240 years with no regard for the individuals. And then because they were commodities, it didn't matter if they died because these commodities were insured.
Yeah.
So owners of these ships were able to reap benefit from the fact that half of their cargo died, or half of
Okay.
their cargo was disease, or had, various kinds of terminal illnesses as a result of undergoing what that experience on the ship was.
Malik,
And
could
then,
I go with that insurance one aspect? Because
Yeah.
I think you hit the fact that we not only have the individuals who transported the slaves, we have those individuals who captured the slaves. We have those in the power bases, the capitalist power bases, both in London and in New York, who are insuring these
And you
trade
have,
commodities.
you have investors also
Yes.
Okay.
who are investing in these as we would invest in companies today who are investing in these ships, who could kind of distance themselves psychologically because they're not on the slave ships, they're not seeing the slave ships, but they are making money from their investments in the slave ships, right? So someone in Liverpool, England, might never see what's happening on those ships, but they are making money from those ships. Right.
Thank you.
Point out one of the principles of business is buy low, sell high, and what they paid the Africans was so small, so little, and if they got to the United States, they sold the slaves for a high price. Poor people could not afford slaves, and so the profit was so immense, they could stand to lose quite a few along the way.
Richard,
From a strictly business point of view,
understood. And could you take us to the next step? And that is, once they hit the shores of the New World,
right?
how were these slaves treated with reference to the manner in which the families existed and the ways in which, they decided where they were going to be?
Yeah. Well, the thing, when they got to the United States and were sold, now instead of being labor, like free people, they became. Wait. Something has happened here. Oh,
We can hear you.
okay, instead of labor, they became capital, and so there was a great interest in them in making sure that the slaves were healthy enough so that they could get a lot of hard work out of them for years. And so, however we might think of it, many of the slaves lived much better than the free whites because the plantation owners had no economic reason to see that the free whites were well fed and housed and all that sort of thing. And if you look at the wages they made as sharecroppers, well, there are a lot of books written by Southerners who just showed how much better off the slaves were, since they were expensive capital, compared to the free whites who were expendable people.
Malik, would you give the description of how the families suffered through this and how they were handled this, and what was done in order to control the slaves that were a little rebellious?
Well,
I do that. Before I do that, Richard, I want to take exception to what you said.
Good.
These people were not treated better than free whites. These people lost their humanity. That there's one thing to try to keep a person strong enough to work.
Yeah.
But when you take their humanity away from them, you take their right to even exist away from them. They are non-entities. They are just like a cattle, a horse, a chicken, a dog. They have a utility, and that utility is one thing, is to produce wealth for that master, that inhumane human being that would have someone in that kind of condition. So psychologically, they were stripped of even believing that they had a homeland that they could relate to. They were then brainwashed. Brian talked about, you know, how the names would change from whom they were to numbers. Well, it went even a little further than that. Then they became non-entities, niggers, coons, all kinds of every possible label that suggests something that's lower than life, that does not even equate to life, that, you know, you have no rights, you have nothing that you can look forward to for life other than working for me until you die, you know. So with respect, Bob, to the family, so, you know, once you get this effort to reduce the people to nothing, psychologically, through your literature, through your theater productions, everything suggesting less than a human being. Then you take that human being and then begin to sell them from one place to the other, you know, to break up their family. This has been a part of the systematic, you know, perpetuation of this enslavement mentality, that you have nothing, absolutely nothing to look forward to.
Malik, when that was taking place, were they also disrupting their culture, their religion, and their families?
In fact, on the cultural front, they couldn't even speak their own language. If they got caught speaking their own indigenous language, sometimes the slave master would cut their tongues out. If they were taught, if they were observed dancing in their ritual dances, they were put to death or some other kind of brutality. Everything about their human existence, from their worshiping of their gods to their cultural outlets, to their socializing, to just even communicating. Even to this very day, Black folks have a difficult time being gathered in one place to communicate. Those are remnants of slavery. So every aspect of them was regulated to the point that if they couldn't think like the way the slave master wanted them to think, they were put to death, or some other kinds of form of brutality would visit them. So these were people that did not have any way to be a human being other than their internal spirit to resist. Now there's a whole another, you know, chapter or body of literature about the resistance movement. But we're talking today about what was done to these people, not what, you know, the resiliency that they had, but what was done to them.
Ryan, can I ask you to come in for just a second?
Sure.
I mentioned culture, and one of the aspects of culture is religion. How did religion get treated, and how did the churches treat the Africans that had come to the United States? Well, how did they consider them, and what should be done or said? How did they preach from the pulpit concerning the treatment that should be meted out to slaves?
You're asking, was that to me? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear first. Sure, I'll answer that. First, I'd like to just add on to what Malik said a little bit, because I agree with what he said, absolutely. But I would take it even a step further, where, you know, Malik had said that enslaved people, you know, were treated as livestock. I would take it a step further and argue they had the rights of livestock, which was none, but they had responsibilities as human beings. So they had the rights, no more rights than a cow, for instance, but yet if they could be charged with crimes and would be punished accordingly, where no one would punish livestock, right? So they were catching a double burden in some sense in terms of because of enslavement, right? this system that dehumanized human beings, right?
May I point out that one of Frederick Douglass's famous quotes is, "I never realized I was a slave until I found out that, right, that there were things I couldn't do." You see, they were slaved in Africa, they were slaved on the way here, and they were slaved here. I mean, you know, you can, and if they were treated like livestock, you sound like livestocks don't have a rich, vibrant life. They have see, plants and animals have a, okay.
Well, I think that if you get back to,
Let's take a look at the whites, though.
Mhm.
If see, that was before Social Security, unemployment, whatever. If they didn't, have some income, they would just die. They didn't have the land. I mean, the few small number of whites basically owned all the land. They were sharecroppers. If you see how much they made, and it was really not that much. And if they had any sense, they would realize they have no hope of becoming rich and powerful like these whites who.
but Richard, do you not think that, if you have a human being
Yes.
who is put through some of the turmoil that is put through to an
Yes.
animal,
Yeah.
they don't have different feelings, emotions, and sentiments as a human being that don't exist with reference to those other creatures that don't have the higher level of intelligence and don't have the emotions and don't have the culture that was stripped from them.
Well, we have some insight into what happens to such people. For example, we have Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and so many other, who who did very well. They're born slaves. George Washington Carver. There are many people who were born slaves and who prospered and flourished. Carver was a world-class scientist. Frederick Douglass was a great orator. I mean, he was really terrific. Harriet Tubman did things a lot of military people would envy.
But let's get back to Sheila. I haven't let Sheila get into the discussion yet. And Sheila, what I'd like you to do, if you'd be kind enough, is we've got to this new country. We've got a Declaration of Independence that we have against the British. And would you contrast the comments that are in the Declaration of Independence with what we ended up with in the Constitution with reference to how we were going to treat the slaves in the southern states?
I didn't exactly prepare for a legal analysis of this, but I certainly would. I mean, I'm struck by, Richard, your comments of perhaps poor whites being better off, worse off than enslaved Black folks. Because I think the key for me is the dehumanization. Is it better to be dehumanized and fed, or human and poor, right? And I think that, our Constitution gives us certain dignities that entitle us to be treated in a certain kind of way and looked at in a certain kind of way, and acknowledges the value and worth of each of us. And I think, therein lies the problem with slavery, right? Human beings are human beings. And when that is denied, it's hard to compare something to that, right?
And Richard, I piggyback on what Sheila just said, and I wasn't trying to be give her a law school exam, but the point is there's called the issue concerning what a slave was calibrated as a 3/5 of a person.
Yes.
And it was done that way in order to give the southern states the representatives necessary so they would join into the union,
Yes,
just
yes.
so to speak.
True.
And then the result of that is you're saying, okay, we're going to count you so that your state can be represented, but we're not going to give you any of the rights that go along with the representation. And so we've stripped, again, as the comment was made, we've stripped the humanity away. And yes, there have been a few outliers that have been there relative to success. You know,
Yes,
people have always been able to overcome certain difficulties,
true.
but that doesn't give them the optimum opportunity of people who don't have some of those same impediments. So
And-
we have, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I was going to say it also doesn't speak to the generational nature of slavery in the United States, the hereditary nature of slavery in the United States. It's not just that the person who's enslaved doesn't have any hope, might not have any hope. And again, I like how Malik talked about in this session, we're talking about what was done to people. There is this whole literature of resistance, right, that we're ignoring right now. But if the person who is enslaved, not only can they not have hope for themselves, they don't have hope for their children or their children's children or their children's children, right? In hereditary race-based chattel slavery, as we saw in the United States.
And is it also so that we have the fact that sometimes their children weren't even allowed to stay with them, and the children were treated and separated from them from time to time?
It's not, I would not minimize it that way. I would not say from time to time or sometimes. I would say much of the time.
Okay.
Right? That was not a rare event. You look at the internal slave trade. So right now we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the United States. But there's a second slave trade that people oftentimes forget about, which is the internal slave trade from Maryland, Virginia, kind of the older colonies, to the deep south of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, parts of Arkansas, with the rise of the Cotton Kingdom. So from the late 1700s up to basically the 1840s or 50s, and approximately 500,000 enslaved people were taken from the upper South and sent to the deep South, primarily young people, primarily young men, to be enslaved in the deep South. And that's another middle passage, right? Because these are folks who had oftentimes been in the upper South for generations, who are now also ripped away from their families and ripped away from everything that they know.
Was there any religious justification
Well,
that was provided for this dehumanization?
Oh yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You asked that question earlier, and I wanted to key in on it. The first side of this was that these people should not be baptized. These Africans should not be baptized because they are not human beings, and their soul would not ascend to heaven or anything else. So they were restricted from coming into the church. And then once that kind of layer passed, then it was okay, if they are baptized, then we have to teach them that it is God's will for them to be slaves. And the whole curse of Ham, who looked on his father Noah's nakedness, and Noah is supposed to have cursed his son, and his son's prodigy would be, people with thick lips and woolly hair, and that they were to forever, for eternity, draw the water and carry the woods of their masters. So this was taught, and that you ought to obey your master. This is part of the scriptures that was being used to perpetuate slavery, so that it was not Jesus the liberator. It was not about love. It was more about, you are this heathen, you are this savage, and that you are lucky that we found you and now we're trying to bring you into civilization, but as a servant, not as a full man or woman, but as a servant who is to serve your master for eternity. That's how it was taught.
And even so, do we have examples with reference to Georgetown and St. Louis University in which the Jesuits actually owned slaves?
Yes, yes.
And there are other religions as well. I'm not picking on them alone, but they come to mind because of the universities both trying to take some internal reparations on that. Well,
Yeah.
we have this, and what I was going to get to before was we have the Declaration of Independence, which has its glorious aspirations. We then have the Constitution of the United States, which embodies the original sin of slavery and legalizes it. And so that brings us to another threshold point, the Civil War.
Well, why don't we deal with the Declaration of Independence, because this is the first time reparation for the enslaved come up in 1776. This is not a 1865 conversation. This came up in 1776, and there were promises that if the American government fighting the British, if they won, they will abolish slavery. Now, the British was also supposedly strong anti-slavery advocates, and they had a group of Black folks that was fighting on the side of the empire to, with the promise that freedom would come. So both sides were promising freedom. The American colonies win, and rather than do anything about reparation or freedom and trying to make good of the enslaved people, they then hardened, they doubled down, and then began to institute legislation and legal opinions and academic opinions to even further the enslavement process. And Brian mentioned this is probably right as we're ending the 18th century. This is when the rise of cotton comes to play. And now there's this effort to really make Black people into machines, based on how much cotton was produced per enslaved person, man, woman, and child, going from about 50 pounds per person per day to as much as 300 pounds, and the beatings and all kinds of things that went, the inhumanity that even went through that process. And then America becoming stronger as a result of its cotton production, and now becoming a world power. But reparation first started before before the Declaration of Independence. So reparation is not a contemporary conversation, and I know we'll get to that, but it goes back as far as when America was still the 13 colonies.
And I would like to add to that, you know, there's a deleted passage to the Declaration of Independence when Jefferson wrote the Declaration that blames the British king for slavery. Right. And a passage that says, and I have it here, I always keep it close by, and he's talking about Africans, and he says, he's waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither, right? And he in another passage, he talks about that the Africans had natural liberties, right? So Jefferson in the Declaration is saying, in the original rough draft, right, that recognizes, of course, that slavery goes against this idea of liberty, right? Of course, that gets excised.
Of course.
That passage gets excised before the final draft. In between July 1st and 3rd, at some point, it gets cut out during the debates,
Yeah.
right? So when we talk about this aspirational nature of the Declaration, it's important to note what was in there and then taken out as well.
And we also had the pursuit of property rather than
Right.
pursuit of happiness
Right.
was a change with reference to trying to accommodate changes as well.
Right.
Okay, I want to move on a little now. I know you have some more things we want to add, but we're at the point of the Civil War from our historical perspective. And that Civil War resulted in, who's going to tell me how many deaths?
Little over 700,000.
The 618 is what they, I understand that is what they historically said, but now they think it's up to 750.
Yeah, they've revised.
I think.
They've revised that
And
in the last.
The other thing is
last couple of years.
that many of those deaths, matter of fact, the majority of them didn't occur on the battlefield. They occurred by reason of the wounds and the way in which we treated the injuries that were there.
And disease.
And the disease and the things that came about as a result of what's there. So we had the Civil War. There are certain people who feel that that was kind of a reparation or of the country for reference to slavery. I want to get your thoughts on that. Malik, and any?
Yes, so I think the Civil War is basically a war not about slavery. It's a war about what section of the country is going to be the powerhouse.
Right.
The Northeast
Right.
or the South. The South was gaining tremendously as a result of the wealth that was coming from cotton, and felt very strongly that they could take on the North. And that resulted in a war. Now, the South was very much pro slavery. The North was developing industry and saw a better use of these enslaved people, and to be able to put them into factories and other kinds of things. But it had nothing to do with the humanity of Black folks. Now, some maybe in the North, a few senators, Stewart in particular, was moved by the oratory as we talked about Frederick Douglass and the whole abolitionist movement. You know, there were people in the North that was genuinely moved what the Quakers was doing and others was doing. So there was an anti-slavery sentiment going on. But, you know, I think that it is a stretch of the imagination to have Lincoln as someone who was, you know, really gung-ho against slavery. He was really gung-ho against the spread of slavery into the territories that they were going to steal and take from the Indians, the Native Americans, the indigenous people. And if those became states, would they come in as a free state or a slave state? We, you know, saw compromises in 1820, the Missouri Compromise, and then another compromise in 1854. A big, almost a war, a civil war that took place between Kansas and Missouri about how, you know, how it was going to play out as the movement west was occurring. But the Civil War was a watershed moment because now you have strong Black voices advocating very specific kinds of things and being able to garner a lot of political support in what they were advocating, which was not what the North was advocating, nor what the South was advocating. There's now a third party involved, and that is the rise of the Black church, the rise of these great civil rights orators, the rise of the abolitionist movement in conjunction with, you know, the Quakers and other, you know, sympathetic whites that were vigorously fighting to end this inhumane system of enslavement.
Okay, now,
I would just, if I could just add real quick
certainly,
there,
Brian, go ahead.
just real quick to that. Secession was about slavery, right? The South seceding was about slavery, right? The Civil War, from the Northern perspective, was not fought to free the slaves, but the South leaving the Union was about, and seceding was about slavery. They made that very clear if you read their the Cornerstone speech, or you know, as historians, the one thing the Confederates did is one of the things they did was they said, and they all had these state conventions on their secession conventions, and they wrote down why they're leaving the Union. And if you read those their articles of secession, they all mention slavery. They all say we're leaving because of slavery. Now, I completely agree that from the Northern perspective, and Lincoln in particular, it was about keeping the Union together, and it was about, you know, it was not. It becomes a war of emancipation later as a war aim, I would argue, right? But yeah, the South is leaving because of slavery.
But may I point out, politicians are always coming up with some fine, popular reason to do things, you see. And they may have been mentioning slavery to rally support, because almost all the Southern people with military experience told them, you can't beat the Union. They've got the machinery, they've got the population. There's no way for the South to win. And so they had to convince people to do a suicide. And the South was destroyed by the Civil War. Mississippi was a powerful, rich, wealthy state, and became, you see what happened to it.
We have the Civil War, and we have, after the Civil War, we have the fact that the Union is winning and is marching towards Atlanta. And we have, at that time, we have the Field Order 15, which goes into place. Anybody want to describe that for me?
I'll let the professor describe it, and I'd like to comment on it.
Okay, Brian, he's making you do the work, and he's going to do the comment. Go ahead.
That's fine. No, that's fine. It's the idea. It's the statement that mostly the Sea Islands of Georgia, right, will be confiscated and redistributed to enslaved peoples for 40 acres and a mule. One thing that should be noted was it also does not say in perpetuity. It is for that generation, right? Because the people in the North, even anti-slavery people in the North, some really did not like the idea of the federal government taking people's property, even Confederate property, right? So anyway, that's just kind of the basics of it.
And just so everybody understands, the reason for the mule was that the Army had a lot of mules as a result of the war. And so it wasn't too difficult. It starts out as just the 40 acres. And the mule was added on kind of gratuitously afterwards because of the fact that they had excess mules that would fit that bulk. Malik, you wanted to add something.
And in fact, that's 40 acres in the Georgia Sea Islands was going to be aggregate of 5.3 million acres of land.
Mm-hmm.
Only 400,000 of it was distributed. And when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Jackson came in as president and repudiated the order of General William Sherman. And that killed, for the moment, the whole idea of reparation for the slave. And it's really important that we see this in historic sense, that Andrew Jackson comes in, you got another 10 years of the Black Reconstruction. This
Johnson.
Excuse me, Andrew Johnson comes in, more conservative than Lincoln, want to appease Southerners as much as he can to try to win them back into the Union. So now there's a strategy about how do we bring those rebellious insurrectionist states back into the Union. So a whole appeasement takes place as Black Reconstruction is also taking place. The 40 acres and a mule gets pushed to the side. The Freeman Bank gets the funding for it diminishes over time. A lot of exploitation takes place. And then eventually the whole idea of reconstruction of the troops, the federal troops being in the South is pulled. And now the Black codes are reintroduced. So reparation has to be viewed from the point of view of here was another perfect opportunity to address this issue that somehow gets supplanted with a reaction, a white backlash reaction on the political scene, on the economic scene, and then socially on the social scene. Worse than, in some instances, the enslavement period.
So and I'm going to paraphrase now, and you stop me if I misstate what you've basically just covered. And that is, there was a promise under Field Order 15 for the 40 acres and a mule. It starts out, it never reaches its full maturity. It's revoked. Even the people who got their 40 acres lose their 40 acres over time. And then we get into the Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction, into which we get the Jim Crow, the KKK, the cultural practices, and the de jure as well as de facto discrimination that's taking place for the
absolutely
for the 100 years that followed the Civil War.
It's all a part of we're going to beat you back into your place. In fact, now that you are a free person, now we got to come up with a whole different circumstance of how we subdue you economically, politically, socially, psychologically, politically, and every other way we can subdue you. Yeah. That, you know, we will never allow you to exercise political power. We will never allow you to exercise economic power. So now there's lynching. Lynching actually spiked after the enslavement period, after 1865. Terrorism, the bombing of Black churches, all of these things begin to spike after the federal troops are withdrawn from the southern states. And that condition goes from about 1877, 78 to 1965 in many states with the Voting Rights Act and all of the civil rights movement. So you had probably conditions worse than the enslavement period after 1877.
That's not to even mention the rise of the convict lease system. When you have the you know, there's a book by David Oshinsky, I think it is, called Worse Than Slavery, and talks about Parchman Prison Farm, right? Where Black men in particular were being arrested for any number of things or nothing, and then sent to the prisons, and then their labor was then paid for by corporations and individuals who then could literally work them to death because there was always another prisoner to buy, right? And that replaces slavery in many ways. If you read, you mentioned the Black codes, if you read, one of the primary sources I like to use with my students is the Black Code of St. Landry's Parish, Louisiana. And it's a list of the laws, right? And it forbids, this is after slavery now, but this forbids African Americans from renting a house, owning land, working outside of a labor contract with their employer, drinking, owning a gun, being in town if they're not in their employer's on their employer's land. And I think what's the most devastating is it also gives every white person, it says every citizen, but that, and when these were written, that's what that meant. It gives every white person police powers to enforce these laws, right? So it gives every white person police powers to enforce any of those codes. And anybody who broke those codes was sent to prison, and then their labor was sold, right? And so this sets the groundwork for the mass incarceration system that we for-profit prisons and everything else that we see today. And it's this backlash theory, I think, is really important to note, that when there is gain, right, after the American Revolution, and African Americans started talking about arguing that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution applies to us too, right? You get the backlash and you get the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, and slavery actually becomes much more restrictive at that time period. Then after the Civil War, when 4 million enslaved people are emancipated, you get the backlash of the convict lease system, the black codes, lynching, Jim Crow segregation. You get the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, right? People gaining civil rights, gaining the right to vote. You get the backlash of the war on drugs and mass incarceration and that.
Brian, can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
You're going the right way. You're not going
Okay,
wrong.
go
But
ahead. Go ahead.
I want to get one last thing. We have a collage that Gerald Jones
Mhm.
has put together. I'm going to put it up on the screen and get your thoughts concerning it. Now, there are 5 component parts, so take your time, digest it, and I'll go around and let each of the panelists give me their thoughts on its relevancy to our discussion. Anybody want to start?
I'll start.
Malik, go ahead.
One of the things that sticks out to me, 2 of the things probably, and I'm not going to deal with the Underground Railroad because that's the resistance side. And as I said, that's a whole nother conversation. And I am very partial to that resistance because I'm a part of the resistance in modern times. But with respect to reparation, the Japanese internment of the 1940s, actually a little before that, but certainly after World War II, after Pearl Harbor bombing, Japanese were compensated for that internment. Some of them were interned only for 6 years. Compare that to 240 years of legal slavery. So there is the issue of what that payment ought to look like. And some economists who've been looking at this, what was lost in economic wages for Black labor, some have estimated that to be between 13 trillion to as much as $20 trillion. I am so much for that. And then just this, the Tuskegee experiment is the other piece that went on for 40 years of people being given syphilis, some, and maybe those who had it and not being treated and being used as guinea pigs. We see the ramifications of that in terms of those who, are very apprehensive about taking the syphilis, taking the COVID-19 test or to get the injection. The distrust that African Americans historically have had in the medical system, or which is a remnants of slavery. So you have Tuskegee and, what the Native Indigenous people went through. That's a whole nother conversation. I'm very sympathetic with them. But if we just look at the Japanese internment that was of a short duration, and the Tuskegee experiment that was very deliberate. And that's just one of the experiments. When you think of people as less than human beings, you can do these kinds of experimentations on them because they're not humans anyway.
Sheila, do you have any thoughts on this collage?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just echo what Malik just said. I mean, I think his, last words are exactly on point with all of this. It's like when you think of people as less than human beings, you can do anything. There's clear equity issues here, it's like it makes no sense that one would get reparations and the other would not. I mean,
Is there any conflict with the fact that you have at least the Japanese internment, the individuals who went through the internment are the ones who are going to be receiving the reparation, whereas we have generation after generation that's transpired since
Right.
slavery, and we don't have the ability to directly recompensate those who went through the institution, only those who are suffering from its consequences today.
Well, I think that the acknowledgement that there are consequences is key, right? And I think that, I've really, really enjoyed listening to the discussion of the panelists tonight, just to get the history. I'm not a historian, and that's not my area of expertise, and it's been excellent to hear all of this. My area of focus of my legal career and of my, just my career in general has been on justice issues and injustice issues. And what I know for a fact is that systemic racism is real today, that structural racism is real, that the ramifications of all of this generations later continue. And so the question that I see now for today is, how are we going to reconcile? How are we as a nation ever going to reconcile unless there's an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and some offering? People will never be made whole from the damage that was done, right? I mean, you can't undo the damage. But you can start here and move forward. And so how do we start here and move forward? And I think that in order to reconcile, there has to be an acknowledgement of wrongdoing.
Okay, thank you. Brian, do you have any comments on this collage, and then on Sheila's comments?
Yeah, I would like to say how much I agree with Sheila's comments. And in terms of the collage, I'd like to focus on the Thomas Nast cartoon that's in the middle, the Emancipation cartoon, because that, for those who haven't seen it, it's if you look at the left-hand side, it's slavery, right? And it's basically before and after slavery. And so the left-hand side, you have a family being broken up by a slave sale, right? You have an enslaved woman being whipped. And then on the right-hand side, you have after emancipation. And it's a very hopeful image, right? It's a very aspirational image. You have Black children coming home to their mother after being in school, and you have the American flag in the background, and you have a church steeple in the background, and you have a man getting paid for his wages on the right-hand side. And in the middle, you have the black family, all whole together, unlike under slavery, right? I think it's interesting to note that a few years after that, after he drew that very hopeful image, Nast has a different image of called The Union as It Was, right? Of a picture that shows a Black family crying because their children have been lynched. Their schoolhouse has been burned. There's a lynching in the background, and the Ku Klux Klan is shaking hands with the White League, right? And that's the same artist just a few years later, after that hopeful time of Reconstruction is gone, right? And so I would note kind of the difference, the missed opportunities there of Reconstruction. And just to piggyback off what Sheila said, acknowledgement is such an important part of this, right? And even if it's generations removed, right? I personally don't see reparations as just for slavery. I see reparations as for the way the GI Bill was unfairly racially distributed, that basically locked most Black veterans out of the first incarnation of the GI Bill that created the middle class for so many white Americans. Housing policies and residential segregation and all these legacies of slavery. I don't see it as stopping in 1865 or in 1876. I see it as part of these structures that are legacies of slavery, right? These racist, systemic racist structures that are part of these legacies of slavery. So there's still generations who are being harmed. Even if we're generations after slavery, it's still feeling the harm from this. The harm is not over yet. It's like Malcolm X said, if you stick a knife 12 inches in my back and then pull it out 6 inches, that isn't doing any good, right? To paraphrase, right?
And to finish that, and even if you pull it out, then you have to heal the wound.
Exactly.
And
So
Richard,
I
there
think
was a
beyond
question.
slavery.
Yeah, Richard, there was a question that Gerald posed, and I'm going to give it to you. And you don't have to answer it, but your first opportunity. Given some of the public perceptions about reparations for slavery, what form of compensation do you believe would be generally acceptable and have a chance of legislative support, if any?
There's no such animal that I'm aware of.
So you see no form in
That
which
would be acceptable to all kinds of people. No.
Any thoughts on that, Sheila?
I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer. You know, it's like, I don't know. I don't know what would be acceptable. What I know is that there seems to be a momentum gaining towards this, towards figuring it out. What was once thought to be impossible is now being considered by many different groups independently. And so I think not having the answer doesn't mean we can't press on to try and figure it out, right? I'm intrigued by this notion of like a certain amount of cash on an annual basis or something, you know, but I don't know if that's the answer either. I mean, how do you make up for the lack of?
May I point out,
Yeah.
if a certain amount of cash, let's say 10,000, 100,000, were to be given to however you identify the victims, that cash would disappear into the banking system and other places within days. I mean, it would just be gone, you know.
Well, let me just weigh in on that. I think that we should
Malik,
be.
before you weigh in, I want to throw these comments out for both you and Sheila, okay? Because I think that you're both getting to some of the same issues, and that is whether there's a monetary component part, there are other component parts. And I think from Sheila's discussions with me before this session, we talked about various instabilities in community of color, housing instability, health instability, quality of education instability, vocational training instability, generational wealth that's been impacted by this. What I'd ask each of you to kind of build on those instabilities and say, is there anything that might work with reference to trying to redress those rather than, as Richard said, a dollar amount may not be the way in which to approach this.
Well, I think,
Malik, go ahead.
yes, I think, Robert, you hit on a very vital point, you and Sheila's conversation. There could be so many remedies. And I think housing and healthcare and education and technical training and other kinds of social systems of support is also going to be a part of that conversation. No question about it. Let's not say that, you know, Black folks would be so irresponsible if they had a boatload of money to deal with. There is economic training that needs to take place. And, you know, we all know that when you begin to put education, layer it with education, layer it with home ownership, layer it with better health care, layer it with social organization, community organization, layer it with building up undeveloped cities like East St. Louis, like North St. Louis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the mentality of the people will definitely elevate to a level that is comparable to understanding the, the fullness of what they're dealing with. I'm thankful that Representative Sheila Lee was able to introduce the reparation study, the whole idea of the Congress undertaking a study of it, so that on the federal level, if it
Well,
passes.
can I interrupt you? Because we're
Yeah.
going to have another session in which we're going to get to some of these points. I want to give Sheila just a
Sure.
chance to at least respond to those.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what Malik said. I mean, I think that, one can say that money would, individual cash payments is not a good idea, and that may be true, but I also believe in the abilities of the folks who would get them to make their own choices, right? I think that the gesture and the acknowledgement of wrongdoing are equally as important, right? The gesture of doing something, like I said, whatever is done is not going to make up for the harm that happened, but it's the acknowledgement that something really bad happened, and the resulting injustice today lives on, right? I mean, I think it's entirely possible to be very creative with reparations also. I mean, affirmative action, right? Down payments on houses, education, certificates that can be used at, different colleges or private education, whatever, I mean, those type of things. I think that we should think outside the box, right? But we also shouldn't be too paternalistic about it either, right? To take away the freedom of choice of people who are the recipients.
Okay, I told you each before we started the program that what I was going to ask you to do is to give the audience a takeaway you have from this session, a question you'd ask them to pose to themselves before the next session, and then if you have a short article or podcast you think they ought to watch, or a longer movie or book they ought to read. So I'm going to start with Brian, you first, if you wouldn't mind, if you have some thoughts on those, because we're wrapping it up right now.
Yeah, so my encouragement for people would just be to, I'm a historian, so I'm going to ask people to read the history as much as possible, and familiarize themselves with this very long and very complicated history that we're talking about, right? There's a podcast called, sorry, let me pull it up real quick, called The Big Payback.
What's it called again?
The Big Payback, like the James Brown song.
Okay.
It's Erica Alexander, who was on Living Single. If anybody, she's an actress, and Whitney Dow, he's the documentary filmmaker. They've done a podcast about reparations, the history of reparations, that's really, really fun and interesting. And the book that I would recommend is one that I'm getting ready to read myself, but I'm recommending it, assuming it's good because of the reviews that I've read. And it's called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGhee. I don't know if anybody can see this or not, but it's making the argument. Too oftentimes, I think reparations gets, people have this assumption that it's like pie, that if you get something, then that means I don't get any, right? And this book is making the argument that we all rise together, the more that people prosper.
Okay.
Right.
And we will put all these names in on the Facebook page. But Richard, do you have any comments you want to make as far as takeaways from this session, or any podcasts or materials you'd like to have read?
Let me point to a solution that all we have to do is look toward Asia and look up tiger mothers, tiger moms, and see how mothers did things to make their children very successful.
Okay.
Without government grants, without this, that, and other, but just the power of mothers to create a vibrant economy like China and India.
Malik, any thoughts?
Yes, I will encourage everyone to read my book,
Okay,
From the Projects to the Pyramid in Search of a Better Family Life, because it is a very inspirational story of not only how I was able to be a part of a family, a poor family that was poor economically, but rich socially and spiritually, and help enable me to build one of the most effective organizations in St. Louis, and that is spreading all over the country. It's a lot of history. It is also a book that tells you why I have been in the resistance all my life, and that I will continue to be in that resistance to create a better family life. So please pick the book up. You can get it on Amazon, or if you write me at Malik Ahmed, 5415 Page Boulevard, St. Louis, Missouri, 63112. I will send you a autographed copy of the book. The book costs $25 on Amazon. If I had to mail it, it would be $30. But this is a book that should be read by everybody, because it's not only about a family, it's also about a community organization that is doing work in the African American community. From the
Sheila?
project to the pyramid in search of a better family life.
Thank you. Sheila, you have any final thoughts?
Just a couple, I would say, as far as a question that to ask people to ponder, what I would focus on is the correlation. This is a racial harmony group, right? The correlation of the question of reparations with the notion and the concept of reconciliation. I'm the director of the Ubuntu Center for Peace, part of Join Hands in East St. Louis. And I think, I would just challenge people to look up that word, Ubuntu, and look up the teachings of Dr. King on what is necessary for reconciliation. Our peace warriors, our young peace warriors at Join Hands, they teach the principles of Dr. King. And I think to return to what he, the wisdom of Dr. King on what is necessary for true reconciliation is really helpful when thinking about reparations.
Thank you. I want to thank each of the panelists for your valuable contributions tonight. I think you have enlightened a lot of us as to things that were not as evident before as they are today. We did not intend to solve this problem tonight. As a matter of fact, we intended simply to pique the interest in it. We want the audience to challenge itself, to open yourself, to explore how justice and equity and fairness can be accomplished today and for future generations. We haven't gotten into the generational wealth and the fact that various segments of society have increased in their wealth, whereas those who sometimes are considered our essential workers have been diminished. We didn't get into tonight the issue concerning COVID and what COVID really showed as far as the disparities between these instabilities in these various communities. And we've learned what may be the options, some of the options, but they're not the only ones. There are more creative options that are yet to be discussed. There are more creative options which you may come up with, ideas that you may have in order to try to make this work and prevent the resentment, and also build on a structure that would have a more permanent foundation. We all have ideas, and those ideas have to be put out there. We sometimes have to brainstorm and come up with new ways of doing things. So what I'd like you to do, if you would, is take these questions. We'll put some more information and reading material on our Facebook page at Racial Harmony, Center for Racial Harmony. And we'd ask you to join us again for our next session. Tentatively, we're scheduling that for May the 20th at the same time, 6 p.m. But that's subject to the availability of panel members, and it's subject to the availability of making sure we don't interfere with something else that you may want to be watching or taking care of. So again, I thank you. I appreciate your time, your attention. Have a great evening. And remember, the Center for Racial Harmony is here to try to start the understanding and discussions. We have to seek first to understand before we can express ourselves as to where we ought to go. So thank you again for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Peace.
Peace.
Peace.